What's up, guys? This is God, Grit, and Glory, and I am your host, Veto Creed. We talk about the stuff that most people stay quiet about: Jesus, business, politics, and occasionally a few conspiracy theories. No scripts, no filters, just straight up truth. So join us as we unravel and speak truth. Welcome, listeners. This is Vito with God, Grit, and Glory, and we are here again to discuss a couple of different cool topics. Specifically, one of everybody's probably favorite here in America. I noticed that this seems to be a very popular day. It's right around the corner, and there's a lot of people that still celebrate it to this day. It's called Halloween, Hallows Eve. So it's an interesting story. So as we were growing up, I think many of you guys, growing up, have different, experiences with Halloween. Some people thought that Halloween was a very enjoyable holiday. They have good memories about it, going trick-or-treating with their families or with their kids or with their grandparents or whatever. But the reality of it is Halloween has some interesting history behind it. So originally it was founded by the Celtic festival, basically. So Halloween's roots go back 2,000 years roughly. It's originally came from Ireland, and so then eventually went into Scotland and all those other countries, and ultimately it was a celebration. They believed it was a boundary between living and the dead. So people had bonfires, they had costumes, there was like ghosts and whatnot. So that the Celtics were the ones that celebrated it, and I thought it was interesting because what had happened was the Christianity, and I say Christianity kind of loosely because Christianity was essentially then taken over by Christianity. I think it was more Catholicism, because you didn't have a whole lot of Christianity back in the days. The 8th century Pope Gregory III established All Saints' Day on November 1st. So essentially it was originally the 31st they were celebrating it, and then he's like, okay, we're going to hijack this holiday and we're going to call it All Saints' Day. In my opinion, it's a blend of pagan holiday plus, Catholic Catholicism, because anytime you have, any kind of saint this, saint that, All Saints Day, that screams Catholicism to me. The Protestant movement didn't really have a whole lot of saints in their movements, and anytime you hear, and you'll hear either online or anywhere else, kind of everybody kind of combining it together and saying, hey, it's a Christian holiday. It was never a Christian holiday. And let's be very clear here. There's a clear distinction between Catholicism and Protestant Christianity. And I'm more of a Reformed Baptist, by my heritage or by my history. My dad was a Baptist that came from the Ukraine, where I'm technically second generation. I was pretty much, raised here my entire life from infancy. So I don't know anything about the motherland, but I will say this, that there are a lot of blends where people tend to blend Catholicism with Christianity together. But I truly think that there's a huge difference between Christianity and Catholicism. And as I talk about this a little bit more, I want you guys to understand the fact that I've always been hard on Catholicism. So just to guys give you a little bit of background, my sister specifically became a Catholic when she got married to her new husband. And my dad spent the later part of his life basically trying to reform her back to her roots, which was Christianity, Protestant. And the reality of it is it was very hard to do, because you guys have to understand that Catholicism stems from a history of brainwashing, in my opinion. There is one specific thing about Christianity and Catholicism that are vastly different. The reason why I think there's a lot of Catholics, and statistically speaking, a majority, and I say majority, especially if you go into Mexico and you go into Argentina and Venezuela and Cuba and any of those areas, anywhere there's Catholicism, a majority of the believers are women. Okay, so why is it that a majority of the believers are women? There seems to be something a little bit extra. But that's a topic most definitely for another day. I just wanted to bring that to light. And that's actually, there's a book that I used to actually hand out to everybody I knew, all the men specifically. It's called Evangelical Feminism and biblical truth. It actually has over 100 disputed questions written by Wayne Grudem. Specifically, he addresses 100 questions that are raised within the evangelical feministic movement. This stems back to the 40s and early 50s. And I think it's important to understand the fact that these questions are not Christian questions. These are actual within the church. These are specific Christian-based questions. So you have something called egalitarianism or complementarianism. And so you have these two viewpoints that, you have one side that's egalitarian, that stems that women and men have equal roles in the sense of a church, in the sense of a household, in the sense of anywhere. Men and women are just basically created equal. There are no distinguishable differences. And if you start understanding that neutrality, you'll start to understand really quickly why there's this gender fluidness that exists in our culture. It actually pretty much stems back from this. Wayne Grudem sort of captured this. He spent a good portion of his life. He founded the book Systematic Theology. I mean, this is one of the greatest books out there. It's a doctrinal book, so it talks about all the doctrinal theology. So it's quite literally what a lot of schools will use for training people in seminary school and stuff like that, where people go to get their doctorate and stuff like that, or their master's program. They'll go and they'll use a lot of their basis off of systematic theology. And it's a very strong book. I think it teaches a lot of fundamental principles that are highly important, highly relevant to our current culture. And the same author that authored that book, which essentially John MacArthur, for those that are familiar with John MacArthur's work, he actually passed away, unfortunately, not too long ago. He's the one that worked closely with a lot of these scholars and sort of helped refine systematic theology. I mean, Wayne Grudem and John MacArthur were similar in their studies. They were deeply rooted in being historians and stuff like that, and doing multiple language. I mean, you got the all their languages that they used, Greek and so forth. But anyways, so this is a good book. We're going to talk about it later. This is pretty much a podcast in of itself. I just wanted to share this book for anybody genuinely interested in learning a little bit more about why are our churches a little bit, feministic, right? And lack of masculinity in our churches. This is actually a very big problem. This is why we lack men. There's no masculine men left. There's a lot of masculine women, even in our churches, more specifically in our churches. So we'll talk about that one later. As I was actually shopping, I thought this was interesting because this is actually Time, where it says Jesus. And I thought this was pretty insane that Time was willing to release basically a Jesus cover, right? The last time we heard about that happening was back during the revival, back in the 70s. I mean, this was the time of the Great Glory movement, or the Great Revival. It's called the Jesus Revolution. I don't know if you guys heard about it, but I found it interesting because it's been a very, very long time since Time has published anything specifically like this. So I thought this was kind of a change of events. And I feel that ever since Charlie Kirk's death, there's been a massive revival. I know for a lot of people that know about this and have been paying attention to some of the media, maybe not mainstream, because mainstream tends to not sort of show any of that. But if you guys have been paying attention to anything non-mainstream about what's been going on in different countries, the UK, Australia, South Korea, they were protesting, they were bringing revivals everywhere and sort of pushing Charlie Kirk's legacy and sort of sharing that with everybody in the world. So I thought that was interesting. So anyways, diving back into kind of historically about Halloween, I am going to share a clip in honor of Charlie Kirk, what he felt Halloween was about.
Halloween is coming up, which is All Saints Day. But let's just be honest. Halloween is a dark, dark day. Not a fan of it. It's what you do with it. Not a fan of all the kind of dressing up and all that nonsense. I don't like it. And if you are a Christian, you must be, and by the way, if you're also a Jew, because this is a Old Testament law, you must not engage in any of these practices of the occult. I find that there is far too much kind of joking around and playing loose and fast with this stuff. There is legit darkness that can be channeled and put into. And by the way, this is an Old Testament law, so this goes for both Jews and Christians.
And so we can sort of expand on that, because I think I think it's important to understand, for people to understand, what is Halloween and why are so many Christians celebrating it these days. I mean, there are so many people, like, we go to a church now. We used to go to a larger mega church here. We no longer go there anymore. But we used to go to a church, and all the churches that I've gone to, with exception of one, celebrates Halloween. I mean, they don't call it Halloween. They call it trunk or treat, or something similar. They've rebranded it, but just because you put lipstick on a pig doesn't make it a different holiday. And I think it's important to understand that the fact that Hallows Eve, which is originated from a pagan holiday, it doesn't matter whether you call it Hallows Eve. And let me tell you why I think this is important. I mean, my background is in marketing. I spent a great deal of time in school, and when I was focusing on my marketing program, I remember, we did something called consumer behavior, and another thing that you do in marketing is branding, right? So branding is everything. As you guys can see, my shirt, I branded this myself. This you can see God, grit, and glory behind me. It's the same colors on my shirt. I mean, this is a brand. Essentially, when people read this, and I'm walking around in public, they could see my shirt, they read it, God, grit, glory. They think, okay, well, that sounds like he's a Christian, right? And so essentially, you can scramble this around and make it mean a lot less, or make it mean something different, because the consumer behavior behind branding means everything. So they've done that with, specifically with Halloween in the midst of Christianity. So, and with a lot of these mega churches, these non-denominational, they tend to do this more frequently than probably anywhere else. I don't think you're going to walk into a setting somewhere in a Catholic church and find, them having a trunk or treat special, right? Maybe they unknowingly kind of celebrate it on the weekends with, families, or, they don't go out and publicize it everywhere. It doesn't get published, in their events calendar or on their Facebook or anything like that. They may celebrate it, and they're quietly in their own homes, but they're not going to go out of their way to publicize it. I thought it was pretty ridiculous that just last year, right before Halloween, on Facebook, I was getting specific ads, and they were targeted towards. And now this is a church. They're actually publishing ads specifically for Halloween. And I thought that, first of all, it's kind of absurd, in my opinion, when churches are doing, ads in general. Why is a church marketing? There should be no reason for a church to market, right? And because when you turn a church into a business, it is exactly that. It becomes a business. It operates like a business. Everything gets streamlined like a business. All of the doctrine gets washed down. Everything gets exactly the same way. So anytime a company's doing marketing, I think that in of itself is kind of absurd. But anyways, we'll talk about that maybe some other time. So as I was scrolling through Facebook, I seen these ads that popped up for this mega church, and I'm like looking at them, and I'm like, and there's skulls, and there's a Halloween jack-o'-lantern there, and I'm looking at this, and I'm like, this is absurd. This is a church. This is a church advertising Halloween, and they're calling it trunk or treat. But if you look at this and you didn't read the little words in the corner, you would think, oh, this is a non-Christian advertisement. You would have never thought that it was something non-secular. So I thought it was very interesting that you could see something like this in a non-secular setting. I think churches that promote Halloween exclusively like this, I think it's quite ridiculous. What they'll do is they have a way of paving it. What they'll do is they'll put a bow on it. They'll say, well, we want to get our community together, and we want to invite them, and we're hoping that we're going to save one soul. We're hoping that we're going to get them here on the weekends, and we're going to be able to bring them in through our doors. That's the whole goal. And when I see that, I think to myself, well, with that kind of reasoning, you can say that just about anything. You could say that about homosexuality. You can say that about transgenderism. You can say that about gender dysphoria. You can say that about abortions. There's so many things where you teeter-totter with entertainment, or straight down to the alcoholism or drug abuse, right? Well, I'm going to walk into a pot shop and I'm going to evangelize to them. I'm going to walk into a bar and I'm going to evangelize to all of the drunks. I'm going to walk into a strip club and I'm going to evangelize to all the strippers as they're standing there naked and shaking their butts at me. That's how absurd this is. It's absurd to me because there should be a black and white line between what's right and what's wrong, what's biblical, what's unbiblical. If somebody comes to me and says, oh, well, I want to celebrate this and this is why, I sort of always think, well, what's the reason behind it? What's the motive? Is there a certain agenda? Is there a personal agenda behind it? Does somebody really want to do this because they get a kick out of it? You know, when I was growing up and we were going trick-or-treating, there was a lot of, and bear in mind, my parents were extremely against trick-or-treating. My parents were the ones that were close the windows, turn off all the lights as soon as it was dusk, you know, on Halloween Eve. And then you basically would hide in your bedroom and wouldn't turn your light on. If you turned the light on, Dad would come in and he'd pretty much smack you. So ultimately, it was one of those households where my parents were extremely strict about making sure we didn't celebrate this holiday under no circumstances. But I do remember one time that, you know, my parents weren't paying attention. I think I was probably maybe around 10 years old, maybe 11 years old, and I had snuck out. And I snuck out, and I didn't have a Halloween costume per se, but I had, I think I had a mask. So I put that mask on. I was running around with my friends getting candy from strangers, and the whole experience to me was kind of eerie because, you know, although I was somewhat enjoying it because I was getting free candy, the experience was eerie because you're sort of, I mean, you know, you're going to these people's houses at night, you know, there's a bunch of creepy people standing there opening the doors dressed like who knows what. I mean, they could be, I mean, this isn't an issue now as much as more of an issue now than it was back in the days. People didn't really think about this stuff. But imagine, you know, they're putting drugs in these candies, right? What if they lace them with something, right? And we heard stories of people putting needles in these candies and essentially poisoning kids. And there's some pretty sadistic people out there. And let me tell you something, with our generation of insanity and our generation of mental illness, you know, as you can see with all the Transformers around, once again, those are transgender, we call them Transformers. I think it's a common problem. I think it's a big issue. So, I mean, you're essentially willing to save $5 because you could literally walk into any store and buy a bag of candy during the time of Halloween for $5, you know, just about any kind. Ginormous bag. And then you can take them home and give them to your kids. But no, you so choose to allow your kids to hop around from house to house and quite literally do the one thing you encourage them not to do is stranger danger. You want them to go and take candy from strangers. The whole concept is so absurd to me, no matter how you look at it. Even without going into the roots, even without going into the history of what forces are behind this and kind of what they celebrated. And there's plenty of people out there. I mean, you can do a little bit of research. You can get online. You can do some research about how people wanted to, ultimately there's people that were in cults or Satan worshipers, and this was one of the greatest days of the year for them. And they said that it had a lot of power in their midst. So they spent a lot of energy preparing for this day the whole entire year. And so I find it crazy that America, and just keep in mind, America, Western civilization, is one of the few countries that celebrated this in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and sort of, you know, all of the other countries, you know, you have, you know, even Japan and Russia and European countries right now that do celebrate it, you know, in spotted areas. But what's interesting is they ultimately follow Western civilization. They follow suit on this because they see America as sort of the, you know, that hierarchy, that pinnacle of exemplatory, kind of like they follow suit. When they see us doing something, they're going to do the same thing. And so we see a lot of this kind of historically starting in America, and kind of America started doing this, and then everybody else in other countries kind of followed suit. And I find it pretty interesting because you go to any other country like, you know, Brazil and some of those other countries, like, and I think Venezuela was the one that just abolished it. Let me fact check this. So specifically, I think I seen this on Instagram where I think one of the, you know, the presidents came out and said, we're not going to be celebrating Halloween. I think specifically it was Venezuela. You guys can fact check that. But Bolivia and Paraguay doesn't actually celebrate it because there are cultural differences. There's differences in this culture that don't support it. But everybody sort of, you know, tries to find reasons for it. I think America as a whole, we have this sort of sadistic kind of, craving for, you know, horror movies. Everybody's watched horror movies. I mean, I grew up around movies like Jason and Halloween, and then, you know, you have Candyman and, you know, stuff like that. They're Jason, and you have those movies where Friday the 13th is called, right? So you have those movies that are more like, murderous movies where there's the plot is, to axe somebody down, or, the Candyman's going to come in the night and, kill you basically, instead of these really demented sort of demonic movies that you'll see now where I actually have, that was probably one of the last movies I seen was probably Candyman when I in my early, not even teens. I think I was 11 or 12 years old. But that being said, our culture has this craving to be scared, to be freaked out, right? You have, all these movies coming out, whether they're Saw or Jeepers Creepers or some of the more recent ones that have come out. I remember one came out back in like the 2000s where it was like the Blair Witch Project. I think I probably seen a little bit of that movie where supposedly 3 people ended up going missing in some woods, and they had a camera, and it was very dramatic. So I find it really interesting because there's a lot of cultural kind of like obsession when it comes to being freaked out, being on the verge of being scared or stuff like that, and people will pay big money for it. They see it as pure entertainment. They'll walk into settings as movie theaters, and they'll sit on their phone or whatever it may be, and they have this obsession with being scared. Right? They want to be scared. They want to be freaked out. But then when they're not sleeping at night, or when they're getting horror nightmares, or waking up and tears or other stuff. They for the life of them don't know what's going on. They say, "Oh, I don't know. I had a bad dream. I had this." Your psyche isn't designed to constantly be exposed to that sort of stuff for just humanistic reasons, right? Just for psychological purposes, let alone all the demonic forces behind it. There's so much demonic forces in this world that we don't see. It's all of the evil spirits around us that, there's probably one around me, because, anytime you're talking about this guy right here, there's a demonic spirit that wants to tear you down. It wants to distract you. It wants to trip you up somewhere so you don't go and you don't preach truth. You don't preach the gospel. You don't preach what God intended us to do, was just the Great Commission. So I think it's interesting because it's very similar that Satan has kind of created this illusion where Halloween isn't a big deal anymore. You have a lot of cultural sort of like desensitization where people are fully desensitized. They sort of like have gotten to the realm where nothing even matters anymore. You're in such a desensitized environment now that you've watched millions of these movies that people are getting stabbed and this and that, whether action movies or horror movies or all these things where people are dying in these gory settings, and then you're going out there and on this one day and seeing all these masks and all these blood and fake blood or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it kind of creates an environment for where people are really, really getting desensitized with this stuff. I think it's always been the goal. That's always been the agenda of Satan, is to create a gray area where everything kind of gets blended. It's quite literally a blend. And I think there's only a handful of friends that I can name that don't actually celebrate this holiday. I have a lot of friends that will dress up, with their kids and say, well, it's so innocent. I'm just going to go trick or treat with my kids around the block. Yeah, no, I don't let him keep the candy. I just throw it away, and then I just buy my own and I swap it. Then why do it? Oh, it's just fun. Why? What's the point? It's one day, right? And it's just fun. I mean, if you want to have fun, go to Busch Gardens. I mean, if you want to have fun, go, to the water park. I mean, I understand that's fun. Take your kids hiking, take them camping, take them to, on a boat, boat ride somewhere. That, in my opinion, is fun. Or take them hunting or fishing. Like, I love hunting. I love fishing. Take them and do something that's, more natural and more productive, and something that's going to maybe instill value or instill masculinity on the children, and not demoralize them and desensitize them and brainwash them to the point where they don't even understand what they're doing anymore. And people, parents, I'm really calling you guys out on this, because there's a lot of you guys out there that are doing this to your children, and then you wonder why they have problems, with their mental health. You wonder why they have some of these, quote unquote psychological issues, and they're waking up with night terrors, or they're distracted in school, or they're acting out constantly. You can only blame yourself for stuff like that. When you raise your kids in environments where the kids are not getting the absolute best environment they could be getting, it really does tear down a child psychologically. And I think that's truly underestimated by parents these days. I think, me being a parent of 4, I'm not just talking here, blowing smoke. I understand that, I have, two boys that are a little bit older. I have a, young, basically toddlers, I mean, he's still technically an infant stage, so I understand that there's a huge difference, between what an adult is exposed to and what a child is exposed to. And I think that these things should basically be separated. And even for an adult to be participating in these, and let's get into that, right? So for all you college students and all you high schoolers that are obsessed with this day, this day of the year, the Halloween, right? So why do you guys celebrate it? Is it because, the girls can dress up like sluts and basically walk around and be half naked, or if not basically fully naked, stimulating guys and basically seducing guys and flirting with guys and stuff like that? That's another side of this holiday that Satan has managed to capture, where he's taken two sides, right? You have the sexualization of the actual holiday, which is the women, and they're being exploited in the way they're dressing. And meanwhile, Satan's having a good old time watching all this, because he's like, look at all these, girls that, their dads can't do anything about it. If the dad opens up his mouth, the daughter's going to say, shut up, dad. I can do whatever I want. I'm 14, I'm 16. But the point is they're literally going into schools during this day and they're dressing like sluts. There's no other way to put it. They're being, provocative, and they're essentially why our, the getting pregnancy rate is very high, right? So as the pregnancy rate goes up, typically abortion rate will start to go higher as well. There's a certain correlation there, because and I think a lot of people don't understand that a lot of the sexualization also overlaps with these sort of bad decisions. Parents start them off young. They say, we're going to do this. It's an innocent holiday. We're going to celebrate it with trick-or-treating. And then essentially it then stems into kids turning into teenagers where they're now exploiting it sexually. So it transitions from one big problem into essentially a much bigger problem, right? Some can claim that it's very innocent when they're young and whatnot. I personally don't think it is. I think it should be completely abolished in a Christian household. I mean, this is specifically for believers, people that claim to be Christians. But let's just say, if you're just a moral high ground individual and you don't think that, Jesus is you're not Jesus centric in your life, right? And you say, well, God is an illusion and this and that. Let's just say this is strictly for conscience and moral ground, right? I mean, what's the point of a holiday that gets so, commercialized? What's the point of a holiday that can essentially have psychological repercussions, right? So anyways, it's outside of just the issue of Christianity, in my opinion. So, but it doesn't dismiss the fact that, I think equally everybody celebrates right now. I think there was a time where Christians would say, oh, you celebrate that holiday, shame on you. And they would sort of shun people for that. And I think we've gotten into a culture where everybody has to be inclusive. You have to be inclusive of everything. Oh, you cannot have hate. You have to be loving, and essentially what happens is Satan has sort of hijacked the church, right? And I can't wait till we start talking about this book in particular, Evangelical Feminism, because this is a lot of where it stems from. This is a lot of where it came from. I think there's a much deeper root. There's a much deeper meaning on why our society has gotten to where it has in our current climate, in our current culture, is because a lot of it started from certain roots. You have certain ideologies, you have certain ideas that essentially they had roots. They essentially were just thoughts, and they turned into ideas, which turn into roots, and then it turns into culture and shifts culture and how people see things. And like I said, I think it's a big problem. It's a big problem with young adults. I think it's a tremendous problem with some of our college campuses. During this day, I mean, people get completely wasted. They get drunk. They go into these college campuses. Maybe they go to parties, and they get really, really drunk. And during those days, I mean, a lot of intercourse, takes place. A lot of, fornication takes place. A lot of frolicking around. Coitus, right? If anybody's seen The Big Bang Theory, I thought it was funny. He called it coitus. But it takes place. And so ultimately you have this thing where it's like a gateway where it opens up the opportunity for people to do stupid things, right? And there isn't a whole lot of holidays out there, maybe St. Patty's Day, which not a lot of people celebrate. And then you have 4th of July, which, But something about, Halloween is where people just kind of just lose their sense of reality. They lose their sense of identity, where they're just engulfed by this mindset where today I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm going to just go out there. I'm going to get belligerently drunk. I'm going to take some pills or whatever is readily available to me. I'm going to smoke some pot or whatever is readily available to me. And I'm just going to act like a fool. And I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And ultimately, they feel that this is the one day where they feel like, they're in Vegas. And they could essentially just turn around and just act like they're in Vegas and do whatever they want. And I think that for Christians to think about this, they really, really have to understand that there's a deeper meaning to everything out there. There's a deeper meaning to, why, people shouldn't celebrate this holiday. It's not just this. It's just, you have to understand. It's kind of like when you start talking about controversial subjects where people get very sort of dicey about, there's certain, topics. We'll talk about, say, tattoos. I don't have any tattoos, but tattoos is a very controversial topic amongst Christians, especially the more modern, progressive Christian, environment or society, I should say. It's where, people have gotten very flexible, right? There's a lot of topics out there that are a little bit more, people are a little bit more gray on it. We'll say tattoos is definitely one of them. Halloween falls into that category. I think feminism is a big one. I think it's one of the biggest ones. In fact, I think the reason why a lot of things kind of slide in between the cracks is quite literally because of feminism. And I'll expand on that reasoning a little bit down the road when I have that topic specifically on this podcast. And I want to basically expand on that. But I mean, you have, like I said, and you have even tattoos and stuff like that. I mean, drinking, and people say, I've even heard Christians claim that marijuana, there's nothing wrong with it. Or we'll say vaping, right? Vaping or cigarettes, right? Cigarettes are really not a very popular thing amongst the young adults anymore, but you definitely had a big era of cigarettes when I was growing up in the 90s, the 90s, the early 2000s. But right now, the big era is these vape pens. You'll have a lot of those vape pens in the I say the youth movements, right? Where a lot of these young adults, they're smoking these vapes. They're saying there's nothing wrong with this, just vapor. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no side effects. Long-term side effects. It doesn't do anything to you. But, and it's crazy because I don't know if you guys know this, but I had this conversation with somebody years ago, and it actually has only gotten crazier because I looked it up recently, where vaping is actually one of the strongest growing businesses pretty much in the entire United States. So I remember the big hype, 10 years ago was specifically marijuana. So I eventually got into vape pens and so forth. And so that being said, it's a big topic, right? And you have a lot of young adults messing around with these things. So sorry, we went on another weave, like I love to do. But the point is Halloween is a very controversial subject. And I think for those people out there that are kind of on the fence, I mean, they should do their research and they should do their due diligence. I mean, do you ultimately want to be in the same, playing field with people that ultimately do this for demonic purposes? People that, go out, let's just say the what originally was founded by, Hallows Eve and, in the Celtics, and they were, sacrificing children and stuff, right? And all of these satanic and all these witches and everybody, they were doing all these rituals, that if for anybody genuinely interested, you could do a little bit of research on it and you could say whatever you want. But at the end of the day, this is one of those holidays that I think should be completely avoided if you can avoid it. I mean, ultimately, I think it's an unnecessary holiday. It brings no value whatsoever to your life. And some will say, well, it makes me happy or makes me feel better. There's a specific individual in my life, don't want to name him because he's real close to me, but he's kind of obsessed with this holiday. And both him and his wife are. And I think it's interesting because they love this holiday, and they'll make all these excuses on why it's a big deal. I'll personally say my dad hated this holiday. He despised it. And I was pretty always neutral on the subject. I think when I maybe got into my early 30s, my mid 20s probably, I started to feel a bit more about it. But probably my late 20s to early 30s, I really started to go hard on, disliking this holiday because I started to sort of understand the roots and kind of where it came from. and understanding just what becomes of it, right? You have all these kids that are affected by it, where you're opening up your household, your family, to all these spiritual realms, to these spiritual worlds. I mean, on top of that, eventually what ends up happening is these kids will go into high school and college, and they'll be participating in other events that are surrounded around these types of holidays, such as, Halloween, where their kids are getting reckless and they're doing reckless things. They're using drugs. They're experimenting with drinking and stuff like that. They're probably, having sex for the first time in their lives and stuff like that. And a lot of those events, I mean, if you look at statistics, they will happen around these types of holidays where, some will say, well, it's the homecoming, or it's prom. Actually, no. You could do some research on this. It's typically where people's entire value system goes out the window. And why does that happen? Because they get intoxicated, or some sort of drugs are involved. So they go to a party. It could be a kegger, there can be some, what are they doing? Jello shots or something, I don't know if they're doing any of this stuff. This is stuff that I grew up around with when I was in my, teens and early 20s that obviously I don't do anymore. In fact, I haven't even touched any alcohol for close to a decade now, even a sip. But interestingly enough, you have a lot of these, areas where this is where the kids are participating in these kinds of events. They're going to these Halloween parties. They're going to these events. They're getting drunk. They're getting, into themselves into trouble. They're probably not using protection. They're passing around all sorts of, STDs and other stuff. I mean, there's a realm of issues around this, right? And then, ultimately, this could be something as stupid as a 16-year-old girl, having a couple of shots of vodka or whatever. We'll just say some rum or vodka or whatever, or have a couple beers, where she ends up getting a little bit too tipsy. She ends up getting taken advantage of by some boy, obviously at a party, because he, young kids, young boys specifically, are there for pretty much only one reason. You got those testosterone flowing through your blood, and so he gets her, takes advantage of her, and so they say, and ends up getting her pregnant. And then, of course, she's faced with a very big challenge, because then she has to make a decision. Do I keep this? I'm 16 years old. I still have a whole life ahead of me. Or do I get rid of it? And that's what happens. And then you're faced with a much more serious problem. You're faced with, the option of whether I should kill my baby, right? And so abortion, of course, is a horrendous thing. And I think anybody that's pro-abortion is, that's a sickening offense, because in my opinion, nobody should have the ability to kill any life, right? That in my opinion is murder. So a lot of people will disagree with me on that case, but like I say, I stand strong on abortion. But the point being is you put yourself in a position, and of course, hopefully through that process, you don't accidentally have, sex with somebody that has some sort of, some STD of some sort and some sort of disease, where then you're stuck with that, whether it's, herpes or something else, or, I don't even know the ones floating around. But it's like you have all these things, these repercussions that kind of follow, and they can completely shift the entire trajectory of your life. And I know some of you listening might be like, well, these are very, very extreme kind of situations you're taking. I'm like, quite literally not. So you can do a little bit of research, and you can find out for yourselves what actually happens at some of these events, how these things, kind of start, and so forth. So kind of going back into this, I mean, we're already running out of time here. I have a few more minutes to kind of expand on this a little bit. Yeah, and so I just to be curious, I ended up just typing it in. I said, is Halloween a satanic holiday?